network security. We'll talk about, to start, network security fundamentals, just some of the kind of concepts that you need to be familiar with, both for the exam as well as to protect the networks that you work on. We'll talk about then planning for network security, kind of helping to identify threats, vulnerabilities, risks, perform risk management, etc. We'll look at identifying different threats and vulnerabilities, so the actual attacks that we can see against our networks these days, and then finally how to go about protecting your network from those attacks. Okay, just best practices, wireless security, network devices, and some of the capabilities of those network devices in terms of security. Now, security is one of those interesting topics because you think, well, I've taken Network Plus, not Security Plus, and that's true, but there's a security section in both A Plus and Network Plus. In fact, the entire domain 4.0 of the objectives is focused on network security. So that to say, this is going to be an important topic. This is not something you just have to worry about in the future for Security Plus. It's definitely something we need to understand and learn for Network Plus. In this first topic, we're going to look at some of the network security fundamentals. What are some concepts that you need to be familiar with from a security standpoint? It's going to be important for us to recognize these, to know exactly what they are, and to be able to explain them. So let's start with just an introduction to network security. Network security has multiple components and concepts, and these are things that do need to be understood by network technicians, because without a clear understanding of the basic components, frameworks, policies, procedures, if I try to manage security, I'm gonna fall short. Okay, we have to have an understanding of all of these things in order to implement security on the modern network. And to be successful, we need to understand it from the ground up, in addition to being able to understand key terms that are used in the industry. So let's start with what's called the CIA triad, CIA standing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are the three fundamental goals as it relates to network security. Confidentiality, is that private information needs to remain secure and accessible only to authorized users. That data should be confidential from the rest of the world. Okay. Integrity, organizational information needs to remain accurate without error and without unauthorized modification. So we need to be able to verify that the data is in the correct form. It hasn't been modified. And then availability. Systems need to operate continuously and the data needs to be accessible to authorized users. Now, sometimes on the availability, that's a head scratcher and you're thinking, well, what does that have anything to do with security? Well, data, in order for data to be truly secure, it is accessible. It's just only to authorized people. Well, that implies it needs to be accessible. It needs to be available. And then as we start going through a little later, the different attacks that are out there, some of those attacks have the goal of just bringing the system down so that it is not accessible to the users that need it on a daily basis. This is just the generic term is a denial of service attack, right? It's attempting to bring down the system so that it's not accessible to authorized users. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those are the three major goals of network security described in the CIA triad. Non-repudiation would be a supplemental goal. That kind of goes along with integrity a bit. We know that the data hasn't been modified. We also have mechanisms in place to know that the sender of the data was in fact the sender. Okay, and so I have non-repudiation. I can't say that I didn't send something, or I can't say that this device didn't send something due to security mechanisms that we have in place. Another term that we want to be familiar with is threat. Network threat is basically any event or action that can cause a breach or violation in security policies or procedures, regardless of the nature of the event or the action. Okay, so threat would be access or modification of data by somebody who's unauthorized. Realize that that could be intentional or unintentional. I don't necessarily mean to breach security and access an unauthorized file, but I may do so and edit it even though I wasn't authorized to do so. Okay, it can be unintentional or it can be with the purpose of harm. Another threat would be any interruption of data access or service access. Physical hardware damages. A threat would be somebody getting into the wiring closet and destroying the equipment or cutting cable. Any unauthorized access or damage to physical facilities as well. Okay. Now, the exam objectives don't spell all that out exactly like that. They basically just say threats, internal and external. So an internal threat is something that comes from inside the company. Okay, this could be a malicious insider. That's a user who's, disgruntled, employee who's disgruntled and is seeking to do harm. Or it can be completely unintentional. Somebody who just doesn't know what they're doing, they accidentally have access to a server and they shut the server down. Or they're trying to do some cleaning and they unplug network components, or they slice wires unintentionally, right? So internal, just they're inside the company. External threats come from outside. These could be, actual hackers who are attempting to get in for whatever reason, notoriety, monetary gain, corporate espionage, etc. They could be business competitors that are trying to gain access to proprietary information. Regardless, they're outside of the organization. A vulnerability is any condition that would make the system more susceptible to compromise or increase risk. Okay, you cannot eliminate threats, but you can in many cases eliminate vulnerabilities. All right. And so the vulnerability is that part of the system that makes it more susceptible to compromise. So think of, you can think of a lot of different things. We actually have them mentioned here. Now, this is known as CVE, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. If you do the search for that in Google, you'll find articles and whatnot that is talking about a lot of these common traits. So improperly configured network equipment. That would be devices that are passing more packets that they should. Firewalls that are allowing more traffic in that they should. Switches that have default passwords. Routers that have default passwords being utilized or no password. Improperly configured and or maintained operating systems or services. Same kind of deal. We didn't follow security best practices when we set it up. Maybe we have more roles and services than are necessary on the server. So that means you've opened up more attack entry points because you're listening on a particular port to an application layer protocol. Misuse of software communication protocols. Poor network design. Poor physical security. Default configurations. This is a big one. If you set up servers and network devices using default configurations, that's a very, very bad idea. Why? Because those default configurations are often already known to attackers, and if they're not already known, they can be found pretty easily on the internet. And so we want to change that. We want to increase security. On databases or elsewhere, but it's specific with databases and web servers and forms, unchecked user input, basically allowing somebody to put in anything to a web form without checking the content. And in so doing, you can bypass security and you can actually execute code remotely on a server if there aren't if it's not checking your input. So anyway, those are a list of some of the common vulnerabilities and exposures and what we need to deal with. A very dangerous vulnerability is a zero-day vulnerability. And 0 day implies that the vulnerability has literally just come out. Okay, we didn't know about this 2 or 3 weeks ago. We haven't had the opportunity to patch this system. This is a vulnerability that's being exploited on the very first day it was discovered. Okay, and so that's what we mean by a 0 day vulnerability. And as you might imagine, they're difficult to protect against because you don't know what you're protecting yourself against. You didn't know about the vulnerability until it was discovered. So the third term with security: threats, vulnerabilities, and risk. Risk is a concept that's indicative of the exposure to damage or loss of a particular component. Okay, risk is not just some arbitrary number. It's something that's calculated, and it's calculated based on the likelihood of an actual threat occurring once all your different factors are taken into account. Okay, so the threats exist, but the risk is greater or less than, depending on a scenario. Just have a real easy one. There's always a threat that a tornado, let's say a hurricane, there's always a threat that a hurricane could come in and have disastrous impact on a physical business. Is that threat a greater risk in the Midwest, or is it a greater risk in Florida? Okay, well, just because of environmental factors, right? It's the risk, the threat is still there. It could happen, but the likelihood that it's going to happen is far less depending on what part of the country that you are in. Okay. So, and you can take that, I mean, that's just a natural disaster example, but it's an easy one for us to kind of contemplate. So risk is taking the threat and the associated vulnerability along with all other factors into account to determine what we need to do about this. Risk is often associated with the loss of a system, network, or other physical losses, but it can also affect people, practices, procedures. Risk is the ultimate determining factor when looking at security and assessing the needs of the organization. Okay, you can spend a lot of money on security in a network, but we want to make sure that our money is being well spent. So part of risk management is identifying risk, identifying our options to mitigate or decrease those risks, and then determining exactly where we want to spend our money and what we should be spending it on in order to protect ourselves. I think we've mentioned AAA. They added a fourth A here, and that's what's listed in the objectives, AAAA. Most security systems will rely on the 4 A's in order to achieve the security goals of the organization. So authentication is the process of validating the identity of an individual, usually through a username and a password, but it could include additional factors. We need to identify who you are so that we can determine whether you're authorized to access resources. Okay, authorization is determining what level of access you're going to have based on that previously validated identity. And I think before I said authentication precedes authorization, but it doesn't imply it. Just because you are who you say you are doesn't mean you can do whatever it is you're trying to do. Both factors are very important. Now, access control is how we determine levels of authorization. Okay, so access control is determining and assigning privileges to resources. That could be a combination of multiple things. It could be just granting permissions directly to your user account. It could be assigning your user account to particular administrative roles or security groups that then provide that privilege. On the file system, access control is typically done through permissions. Do you have the permission to read this or don't you? Do you have the permission to modify this or don't you? In some applications, access control is done through role-based access control. So you are assigned a particular role within the software application, and that allows you to be authorized to make changes to it. And then finally, auditing or accounting, which is just simply the process of tracking and recording activities on the system like resource access and administrative access types of things. Auditing or accounting policies are usually behind the scenes, and they're just keeping track. They are registering events that are collected in logs anytime somebody accesses this file, anytime somebody logs on to this server. In the cloud, anytime you make changes to a user account. Behind the scenes, there's an administrative audit log that's potentially keeping track all of that. So authentication, authorization, access control, and auditing. Another concept that we need to be familiar with is the concept of cryptography. Cryptography is technically the science of encrypting and decrypting data in order to hide information. When we talk about security, cryptography is always going to be at the forefront. It's rooted in mathematics and computer science, and it relies heavily on the vast capabilities of computers and technology in order to do its job. True cryptography is just the concept of encrypting data so that it is only accessible to an authorized individual. This goes beyond permissions. We've now physically changed the data into a form that can't be read by anybody other than the intended recipient. And that recipient will have a key of sorts that turns the encrypted data back into decrypted data. The term cipher is just related to the algorithm that turns plain text information into ciphertext. Okay, plain text is readable, ciphertext is not readable. The algorithm is the mathematical algorithm that will perform that encryption. And there are a couple different kinds. This is probably more than you need, but stream ciphers will encrypt 1 bit at a time, and therefore they're much faster and less susceptible to errors than other ciphers. Block ciphers encrypt data 1 block at a time, often in 64-bit chunks. It is more secure to do it that way, but it is generally slower. Now, we've used the term algorithm. The algorithm is the rule or mechanism that is used to encrypt data. I'm sure many of us at some point in our lives have encountered some form of substitution algorithm. Okay, there was one called the ROT13 algorithm, and this is the kind of stuff that you used to, as a kid, could see on the back of cereal boxes and spy booklets and things like that. It was just an effort to be funny, but I mean, basically all you're doing is saying, okay, ROT13, you're going to rotate forward 13 in the alphabet. So an A is not really an A, it's 13 characters later, which I believe is an L, maybe M, something like that. Okay, so and all you have to do is, it's a standard substitution cipher, and you can fill it in and you can figure it out. And there are different forms of those, but that's a lot of times what algorithms are doing, is just the form of substitution. The deal is, though, this is done by computer systems. It's been done by computer systems, so it's way beyond what we as humans could fathom, and it becomes very, very secure and can happen very, very quickly. So the algorithm is the rule that encrypts it. The key is the piece of information that determines the result of an encryption algorithm and is required to decrypt the data, turn it back into plain text so it's readable. And there's two basic kinds of keys, symmetric and asymmetric. A symmetric key, with symmetric key encryption, I should say, there is a single key. So the key that's used to encrypt is also used to decrypt. All right. In asymmetric encryption, there are two keys. One is considered public and the other is considered private. Okay, the private is kept private to that system. The public one is made available to others so that they can encrypt data. Now, symmetric key encryption is the fastest and the best, but it suffers from having to share this key. Like, I have to get you the symmetric key in some way. And so a lot of times what we see, especially out on the internet, is a combination of the two. Let's use SSL as an example. Okay, SSL is Secure Sockets Layer. It's HTTPS in your web browser. It's basically what you are using the vast majority of the time on the internet, anywhere where you would be putting in any sort of private information, credit cards, payment checkouts, anything like that. But if you look up in the browser, a lot of times these days you're going to see HTTPS. Well, what happens is the server has a web server certificate. That server certificate comes with a public and a private key pair. Okay. When you connect to the server, when the client connects to the server, the public key is in the certificate, so it's accessible. So the client grabs the public key, it generates a session key, which is a symmetric key, that it now needs to securely get to that web server. Okay. So I'm going to use the public key of the web server to encrypt my session key and send it in an encrypted fashion. Now, only the server that has the corresponding private key is able to decrypt it. Okay, so the client, not the server, the client generated a unique session key just for me and this server, encrypts it with the public key of the server, sends it to the server decrypts it. Now they've just securely shared this private key, and all data can be encrypted and decrypted using that exact same key. Okay, and we find that a lot. It's often not one or the other. It's a combination of both, asymmetric and symmetric. So symmetric is single, or also known as private key encryption. Asymmetric is two keys. It's also referred to as public key encryption. Another concept is digital signatures and hashing algorithms. Hashing algorithms do encrypt data, but it's a one-way form of encryption that takes clear text and turns it into ciphertext that is actually not able to be decrypted. Okay, that's why we call it one way. The purpose is not to decrypt. It's a one-way encryption, and it's referred to as a hash value. Also, sometimes a message digest would be the other name. Digital signatures apply that message digest or use a message digest that's been encrypted again using the user's private key. And so it uses asymmetric encryption in addition to one-way hashing of a message digest. And this is for verifying the integrity of data and providing non-repudiation. Okay, encryption is just to securely transmit something so that it can only be decrypted by the appropriate party. Hashing and digital signatures are a way for me to validate the integrity of the message and validate myself as the sender. A hashing algorithm, basically, if you take a group of bits, zeros and ones, and you feed it through a hashing algorithm, it's going to have a specific hash value. If on the other end you use the same algorithm and supposedly the same data fed through the hashing algorithm, then the two digest, the values will be the exact same. If one bit changes, the hash value is going to be different. Okay, so that's how it validates that, okay, what you sent is actually what was received, and you've stamped it with your own digital signature, your private key, which I can validate with your public key, and verify that you actually sent the message. This is used a lot of times in email encryption. Okay, so we can have both email encryption as well as digital signatures to validate integrity and provide us with non-repudiation. In terms of security on the network, we have many best practices that we want to follow. A couple of these are mentioned in the exam objectives. So best practices for permissions. One is implicit deny. Implicit deny is the concept that whatever's not explicitly allowed is implicitly denied. Okay, so basically, if you're not on the list with the required level of access, then you're denied that access. That's used in the file systems. It can be used on firewalls, although explicit deny statements might be used on a firewall as well. Okay, but the idea is you don't, this isn't a list of people who can't, it's a list of people who can. If you're not on the list of people who can, then you're not going to be allowed in. Least privilege is another best practice. That's a concept that states that users and software should only have minimal levels of permission that are required for performing their duties. Okay? I don't want to give you administrative rights if you don't need them. So we're always factoring that in within an application, within a technology like, cloud technologies, just administrative access on servers. We have to determine exactly this is what you need to be able to do, and then I only grant you the permissions to do that. Okay. It doesn't imply that permissions are granted for a specific task and then revoked. That would be called privileged bracketing. We're really just talking about not giving you excessive permissions in any area. Some best practices for employees are separation of duties. The separation of, this is a principle stating that no person should have too much power, as it would provide the ability to abuse that power. It's also known as role separation. So duties and responsibilities should be divided among interested and capable parties. For instance, in from a tech standpoint, we might have different people that are doing the backups and the restores. In a change management process, we wouldn't have the same individuals responsible for approving change as well as recommending change. Okay, you want to separate duties. Job rotation is another. No person stays in a vital job role for an extended period of time because it makes sure that no person is irreplaceable, and that kind of goes right along with separation of duties. And then the term role-based access. Role-based access is really dependent on the software, but a lot of applications utilize role-based access control now, to where there are predefined roles within the software that allow you different level rights. And so we don't have to create groups. We don't actually have to assign permissions. We can just assign you to a particular role. And that's going to then still help us to follow that whole concept of least privilege. And another common term for security is defense in depth. Defense in depth is simply a layered approach to network security. So it divides the network into different layers like perimeter, network, host, which would be the servers themselves, application, data. Okay, and it allows us then to focus security controls on a particular layer. What this ends up being is a more structured approach to security that it makes it less likely for us to forget things, to leave holes in our security controls. Now, the layers are actually what is there in the graphic. For whatever reason, CompTIA just has defense in depth, and then it has these 5 sub bullet points. Now, it is, these are legitimate things. It's just not what it's not what is usually talked about. Usually, we talk about each layer, and then we talk about the controls at each layer. So they've just gone about it a different way. Network segmentation enforcement, making sure that we have physical segments of the network, making sure that we have firewalls protecting us, and making sure that we've got even packet filters on routers. That could fit in really either at the perimeter or the network layer. A screened subnet is something at the network layer. Also, though, could be used at perimeter. Perimeter is just anything that's going to outside of your network. Screen subnet used to be referred to as the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone. It's basically a quasi-public area. So you've got servers that are accessible from the internet, but they are still protected with a firewall, and then we are tightly controlling what can happen from those servers to the internal network. Network access control would definitely be at the network layer. NAC is a way to enforce certain security policies and settings on clients when they go to connect, whether that's Ethernet connections, wireless connections, VPN connections. Network access control, aka network access quarantine, has the ability to enforce security. You're connecting, I need to make sure that you're up to date on your patches and that you've got a firewall turned on. That kind of thing, okay? That's network access control. Honeypots, this one surprises me that they have it here. This is definitely more of a Security Plus thing. A honeypot or a honeynet would be a system or network that was set up to entice attackers. Okay, it's set up, it's segmented from the rest of the network but the goal is to get people in to it so that you can monitor their activity, monitor how they got in, the methods and the approach that they took, and then what they're doing while they're there. So that's definitely a kind of a security mindset. And then encryption can be done at the application or data layer, and that is, as we just described, making sure that data is unreadable except to authorized users. So again, I find the sub bullet points a little bit odd here because they're just giving specific examples of things. It's not really talking about defense in depth. So I threw the graphic up as well. Defense in depth, a layered approach to network security, and something we should all adhere to. All right, so now we've gone through security concepts and principles that are important for us to understand. In this topic, we're going to be looking at how we go about planning for network security. That is, designing and implementing controls, but really just the planning phases of it. Planning for network security involves identifying risks to organizational assets and then managing those risks in the appropriate fashion. The first step to managing risk is to understand and manage the source of those risks. And we've briefly talked about threats and vulnerabilities. The threat is the actual potential attack that could occur. The vulnerability is the scenario that makes that threat more likely to be successful. And so we talk about threat vulnerability pairs, and those assist in risk mitigation because I have to understand the combination of the two, along with the likelihood of something occurring and bringing the system down, in order to effectively decide how we're going to handle that risk. The term risk mitigation, you could just say minimize. You can't completely eliminate risk unless you eliminate the technology that's associated with them. So you typically don't eliminate. You either accept it, transfer it to somebody else, or you put in protective mechanisms to make it much less likely that that threat would succeed. So threats are any activity that represents possible danger and can adversely affect the fundamentals of security. That's confidentiality, integrity, or availability of our assets in the organization. As we said before, they can be unintentional and intentional. Unintentional would be things like environmental threats, human threats where it wasn't purposeful, but it was just done inadvertently, like an accident, a failure of a security mechanism, potentially. Intentional threats are those that are driven by greed, anger, the desire to damage. Attackers will have different mindsets when they're trying to perform an attack on organizational assets. But if it's purposeful, then it's an intentional threat. Vulnerabilities, as we said, represent weakness in an asset or the environment. That possibly could be a flaw in the system. It could be a flaw in business processes. A flaw as in code flaws, but it could also be a flaw as in weak default configurations, lack of security controls, etc. Vulnerabilities lead to risk, but they themselves do not become a loss. So just because you have a vulnerability doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be exploited. But once a threat exploits a vulnerability, then that's when we have a potential loss that can occur. And so the threat vulnerability pair represents that relationship. The vulnerabilities are going to vary for each organization. The list can be extensive. We already went through some common vulnerabilities. But it's important to identify both the vulnerability and the threat, because we can see that the risk equals the vulnerability times the threat, not just an arbitrary number, but an actual calculation as to what the associated risk would be. Vulnerabilities can be identified in different ways. Vulnerability scanning, this is a set of tools that will actually look for and try to exploit vulnerabilities. Now, that can be done in a credentialed or non-credentialed manner. Credentialed manner just means that you're actually providing usernames and passwords to the destination system in an attempt to get into it, whereas non-credentialed, you're accessing it anonymously, as someone would in a public setting. A vulnerability scanning can take a next step into what we call pen testing or penetration testing. The difference is that vulnerability scans are typically just looking for the vulnerabilities. They're not, and I think I made a mistake and said they're not actually trying to exploit it. Trying to exploit the vulnerability, trying to actually get into the system would be penetration testing. And organizations can do this internally. They can also do this in conjunction with outsourced security firms. And it's a whole niche in network security. You can become a pen tester, and that's what you're trying to do. You've been hired by a company to try to get through their security controls to find out where they may be lacking. Now, there are a lot of different types of vulnerabilities. As I said, we mentioned some of these. Unnecessary running services on a server can lead to open ports, both physical and virtual. The services are associated with application layer protocols. The application layer protocols are associated with a particular port. And if it's not necessary on the server, then it represents an avenue to get into the server that really shouldn't be there. Unpatched systems or legacy systems, these would just be older operating systems, older network devices that provide more vulnerabilities. Often legacy systems can't be patched anymore. And so if vulnerabilities are found in the code, there's nothing that we can even do about it. So we need to try to get rid of those types of systems. Unencrypted communication channels that are passing information in plain text that can be easily captured. Simple passwords or default configurations that use default passwords on network devices, also a big vulnerability. And then the use of any sort of unsecure protocols. Telnet's a remote administration protocol, but it doesn't support encryption. And so it really should not be used, and instead SSH or HTTPS management should be used instead. HTTP, standard hypertext transfer protocol without the use of SSL, would be passing authentication credentials in plain text. SLIP is a fairly antiquated remote access protocol that also is plain text, as is FTP, file transfer protocol, and TFTP, trivial file transfer protocol. The first there is used to actually access storage over the internet. The second is used in a reverse fashion, usually to push configuration information to network devices or network boot systems. SNMP has 3 versions. Really, version 3 is the only one that should be used today. SNMP v1 and v2 are susceptible to numerous vulnerabilities, lack of encryption that the later versions would not be. Now, the term risk is used to describe the likelihood that a loss would occur when a particular threat exposes or exploits a vulnerability. The probability that a particular security threat will exploit a particular vulnerability, right? We said the threat-vulnerability pairs. And risk exists in all organizations. They range from minor to major. The amount of money and time and effort we're going to put towards these risks will depend on the category of risk. Security administrators have to perform adequate planning to determine exactly what should be done about risk, and that is termed risk management. Okay, and we've got basically 4 options. We can avoid the risk, or you could say eliminate. I said before, you can't really eliminate all risk, but you can eliminate certain risk by getting rid of the associated technology. Okay, so for instance, maybe the organization has determined that allowing people to access email systems from mobile devices, phones, is too great of a risk. And so they avoid it by turning off that functionality. That functionality is inherently in the email system. However, if its risk is seen as too high, then we may not allow it. Same thing with like webmail. We could transfer the risk. Transferring the risk means you're actually transferring the risk itself to an external party. Okay, this is done through cybersecurity insurances. And the cybersecurity insurance will require that you have certain security controls in place, but then they're willing to accept the risk and pay to restore data and services if that risk has happened. Another type of transferring would be moving systems to the cloud. If I move systems to the cloud, then I'm using platform as a service or software as a service, I'm really no longer responsible for inherent risk like patch management, or vulnerabilities, I should say, like patch management. Mitigate means to minimize. Mitigate means we're actually going to put in separate controls, security controls, to try to lessen the likelihood that a loss will occur. We're going to keep the technology, but we're going to implement security mechanisms in order to lessen the likelihood. And then accept just means, well, I'm going to accept it. I'm not going to do anything about it. That may sound odd, but some risk are minor risk due to, environmental factors and things like that. It's very minor in the likelihood that it would happen, or it's very minor in the effect that it would have for the organization. And so we choose not to implement security controls. And sometimes we're choosing not to implement security controls because the cost of implementing said controls, it outweighs the risk. All right. And so, as I said, risk management it's a big part of being a security professional. Therefore, at this point, we really just want to try to understand concepts. Risk assessment are assessments that are done at the organizational level to try to evaluate our exposure to risk. A posture assessment is an assessment of the overall security posture of the organization. Business risk assessments, we can assess certain processes and look for holes in them that could be used to exploit a vulnerability. We can assess the use of particular vendors based on the functionality they provide or their devices provide, the service that they provide, and the history of that vendor. In this next topic, we're going to look at identifying threats and vulnerabilities. Now, we've talked about these already, but we're going to get into some of the specific attacks that we need to make sure we've protected ourselves against as an organization. Threats come in different categories. There could be software-based threats. Software-based threat is actually utilizing software, like malicious software or malware, spam, adware, grayware, ransomware. We'll go through a number of those, plus your just standard virus, worms, trojans, etc. They exploit software vulnerabilities, and they allow an attacker to gain control over a system in an unauthorized fashion. Technology-based threats are the actual attacks like port scans, denial of service, etc., that seek to gain entry, unauthorized entry, into an organization's network. And then social engineering, that threat category actually targets human beings. So phishing campaigns, shoulder surfing, we'll go through various options there. The defense is often user education, but we also can have some technical controls that are put into place to stop things like phishing attempts. Now, all attacks will share the general goal of attempting to disrupt systems, to steal information, or other purposes of exploitation. A software attack is any attack against actual software resources. So that can include operating systems, applications, protocols, etc. And realize here that the categories are to differentiate between different types of attacks, but there are often going to be multiple combinations that are used. So malicious code attacks, or malware, this is a special type of software attack that uses programming code with malicious intent. The general purpose is to disrupt systems. They can do so by deleting data, corrupting data, allowing unauthorized remote control of the system through malicious code. Malicious code attacks are dangerous because they can go undetected for long periods of time. Sometimes the malicious code attack is then used later for like a distributed denial of service attack to remotely access the system, or used later for the purposes of identity theft. So they can sit dormant on the system, and unless they are seen by antivirus programs and removed, then they can have detrimental effects in the future. All right, so let's go through some types of malicious code. Viruses that's the common term that everybody's familiar with. A virus is malicious code that attaches itself to other programs or data files. The other program may or may not be destroyed. Okay, but when executed, the virus executes its payload, and then it can, again, corrupt or delete data. Worms are different in that they replicate themselves. They're not really associated with a data file or a program, and they cause problems just because they are there, essentially. They replicate themselves. They consume network bandwidth. If one system has a worm, then it tries to copy itself to all other systems that don't have it. So these can be very, very difficult to get rid of. Trojan horses comes from the old Trojan horse story. It is a delivery vehicle for destructive code. So often viruses do that, not always, but often they do damage the file that they're associated with. Trojan horse does not. It hides itself inside another program. The other program appears to install and work as it was originally intended, but behind the scenes, the Trojan horse is dropped. Trojan horses are notorious for identity theft and allowing unauthorized remote control of the system, sometimes through distributed denial of service attacks. I'm going to skip Logic Bomb just to go to zombies and botnets because that's what we're talking about. If a Trojan horse is sitting dormant, then we have a central management system somewhere out on the internet that can call potentially hundreds or thousands of individual systems that have been infected with that Trojan horse. That creates what's called a botnet, and the individual devices are called zombies or drones. And what usually is done is those systems aren't the ones actually being exploited. We're utilizing multiple remote systems to send denial of service attacks to a victim's network or server. Logic Bomb is a program with hidden code that's designed to run when a specific condition is met. Could be a certain date and time. It could be a timer that is just elapsing, and once it reaches 0, then the code is executed. These are notoriously done by malicious insiders and disgruntled employees that would leave something that where if it's not checked on a regular basis, if it's not updated, then it executes that malicious code. Rootkits, that's software that grants full system control to the user. A rootkit is activated when the operating system boots up, therefore they are more difficult to protect against, but they're also very dangerous in the level of permissions that they have. Okay, not just full administrative access, but often full kernel access to the operating system itself. Spyware is a term that's used for really any software that's spying on individuals. Now, we have a tendency to use terms spyware and adware synonymously. Adware would really be software that's popping up or that's creating pop-ups, generating advertisements that are unsolicited. Whereas spyware, it has the actual goal of identity theft or unauthorized monitoring of an individual's, internet practices for the purposes of advertising. Spyware and adware both have the disadvantage of just slowing down a system. Ransomware is a distinct type of malicious code. It's very prevalent today. It's where data on network servers or clients is encrypted, and the users who own that data don't know the decryption keys. And so none of the data is accessible now, and the data has to be decrypted. The only way to decrypt it is to pay the ransom. That's why they call it ransomware. And sometimes they want thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The only effective way to get rid of it is to restore a backup where the ransomware wasn't and to find the entry point into the network. Multi-factor authentication, by the way, is a primary defense against ransomware, as is controlling any sort of remote access to the network, not just leaving like RDP open. Notoriously, if somebody has been affected by ransomware, it is because they have RDP or some type of remote access open. Network threats come in two basic varieties. We have reconnaissance and active. Reconnaissance threats seek to gather information from the network. That in and of itself is not necessarily dangerous, but that information can then be used at a later time. So it's still not something that we want to allow. Like a port scan would be a type of reconnaissance threat. I'm just scanning for open ports and IP addresses, and I can use that information to determine the role of servers in that network based on what protocols they're listening for. Active threats are actual threats that are launched against a system and its vulnerabilities trying to break in. Most businesses rely on technology in order to function on a daily basis and in order to meet business goals. And so it makes the network a likely candidate for an attack. If somebody's trying to bring your system down and make it unavailable, then they're going to target the network. If they want proprietary information, they're going to target the data storage on that network. And many components and technologies provide ample threats to network security, and so it's extremely important that we plan for those threats and vulnerabilities, that we assess risk, and we deal with that risk. Port scanning attacks utilize software that's used to determine the ports that are open on a destination system, because open ports, as we've said, identify running applications and services. Open ports can also be used to determine the vulnerabilities that are available for exploit, but it could be just reconnaissance. They're just trying to diagram a network. So, a server's listening on port 25, it's an SMTP server. You can then telnet into port 25 and you'll get a response, and that can tell you the vendor. If it's Exchange, it'll identify itself as Microsoft Exchange and even potentially a version. So that can be used to gather information about the network. Many port scanning utilities are available freely on the internet. Eavesdropping is using packet capture software in order to collect data packets and then read the contents. These are also sometimes referred to as packet sniffers. Wireshark and Ethereal are probably two of the most well-known packet capture software out there, and they are both freeware. IP spoofing is an attack where the attacker creates IP packets with fake addresses in the headers in order to gain access to a remote system. Often a key indicator of this type of attack is when a packet arrives on an external interface with an internal source address. Thankfully today, routers and firewalls are typically configured to drop such packets by default. VLAN hopping is an alternative type where it isn't actually modifying the IP addresses in the headers, but it's spoofing the VLAN tags that are used to segregate, VLAN 1 from VLAN 2. So the concept is going to be the same to make it appear as if I'm someone who I'm not. A denial of service, or DOS, is a network attack. Its sole purpose is to consume or disable network resources. Servers and their operating systems, they're meant to provide certain capabilities. I'm a web server, I'm an email server, I'm a SQL server. But if you hit that server with too much of even a valid type of packet, it can cause user applications and operating systems and services to crash. So we can clog web servers with illegitimate traffic, email servers with junk mail. We can consume disk space, memory buffers, queues, etc. So the whole purpose of this is to send numerous packets. They are packets that the server is expecting. They are packets that the server is accepting. However, it's done in such an amount that it prevents, legitimate use of that server. There are different types of denial of service. A reflected attack. The victim is usually the remote system using the address that's spoofed in the packet headers. So basically an attacker is hitting a destination network or server, and it's spoofing the headers so that all of the responses go back to the victim server. DNS, network time protocol, smurfing, those are a couple different types of reflected attacks. Distributed denial of service is what we had already described. We're going to put usually malicious software on multiple systems so that they all target the same victim system. You can obviously generate a ton more traffic if you have multiple systems in comparison with if you have just a few. Okay, so botnets, traffic spikes, a coordinated attack, these are all types of distributed attacks. And then amplified denial of service is where you hit a router and you hit it with the subnet broadcast address as the destination. So it causes the router to flood the subnet and hit all systems and consume bandwidth. And that's why they call it amplified. So it's just between me and the router, but then it amplifies it to include or attack other servers and systems on that network. An on-path attack used to be known as a man-in-the-middle attack. This is where the attacker positions themselves between two hosts that are communicating with one another and listens in on the session. Okay, so it's doing eavesdropping. This can just be used to steal information in the cases where encryption is not used. It can be used in a form of web spoofing or session hijacking, where the attacker is actually assuming one part of the communication, often in order to capture credentials. Multiple methods for doing this: ARP poisoning, so that's poisoning the ARP cache that maintains IP address to MAC address mappings, and giving a bogus MAC address, or my MAC address, as opposed to the actual server's MAC. ICMP redirect uses the ICMP protocol to redirect echo requests, echo replies. DNS data can be manipulated and poisoned, whether that's the DNS cache on the client or the DNS cache on a server that is serving as a server for multiple clients. It can have the same effect. This name no longer maps to the appropriate IP address, and instead it is sending to the attacker's system. And then header manipulation, IP spoofing, would be another mechanism by which on-path attacks can occur. All right, then we have the human attacks. So the first is not really social engineering. Password cracking is an attempt to gain usernames and passwords. Of course, you could do password cracking just by making guesses, educated guesses, if I have knowledge of the person, their family members, pets, things like that, and we're using weak and simple passwords, then that's a type of password cracking. A dictionary and brute force, though, both use software to do it. So dictionary has a dictionary of common words, dictionary files, and then it tries to target and log in by utilizing those passwords. Okay, account lockout mechanisms can prevent this on a live system, but dictionary-based attacks are often targeting the actual security files that store username and password combinations. And if I can get those in an offline fashion, then I can take as long as I want to try to crack passwords. Those passwords are not stored in plain text, they're stored in hashes. But as we talked about before, you can use a hashing algorithm, and if you plug in the word Apple to a hashing algorithm, it's going to produce a specific hash. If you plug in, Apple's 1, it's going to be a different hash. So they're using the algorithm and comparing hashes. And the difference between dictionary and brute force is brute force just goes one character at a time. Okay, and it goes through all these possible characters, letters, numbers, special characters, and is trying to brute force the password. Social engineering is when we target actual human beings. Probably the most common social engineering would be phishing. The idea is that you bait the hook and you send it out and you're hoping somebody takes a bite. Okay, and we know that's what real phishing is. In network, from a network standpoint, phishing is usually targeting email systems. So where often users receive an email that appears to come from a legitimate source, like a credit card company, asking them to validate their information, to click on a link, to type in their username and password. The problem is the link is not actually taking them to Chase or Capital One or whatever bank they use. It's taking them to the attacker's system, and their usernames and passwords, and sometimes even social security numbers, are being collected. Other phishing would just maybe target people for donations, target people to communicate with somebody to receive the riches of a Nigerian prince, and we're not joking. You've probably gotten emails like that. Spam and phishing kind of go hand in hand, and user education is one of the best ways to get around phishing, but there are software systems that are used so that users can report phishing attempts, and those same software systems can be used to actually send phishing campaigns. So these are actually messages that are sent by the security department of an organization in an attempt to not trick people into clicking it, but get them used to things. Okay, like hovering over a link and actually seeing where it's going to go. For instance, tailgating is usually associated with physical security. So we have locks on our doors, we may have key fobs to gain entrance into an organization's either just the business as a whole or certain areas like the server room, wiring closets, things like that. Tailgating is when you would follow somebody else in. They use their key, they open the door, and then being a nice human, they hold the door open for you, and you just got into the area without having to scan your key card. The same kind of term is referred to as piggybacking as well. Shoulder surfing it sounds a little odd. That's basically just looking over somebody's shoulder to try to gain usernames and passwords. If you think about it, usernames are pretty common. They usually follow a general naming convention of first name dot last name or first initial last name. So it's really just the password that I have to get. And so if I'm looking over somebody's shoulder, trying to guess what their password is or see the general form, then that can be an effective way of then logging on to the system as their account. There are a few vulnerabilities that are specific to wireless. One of them would be lack of authentication. If we allow people to connect to an SSID without requiring authentication, then that is an open access point. It's inherently insecure and would allow me to gain access to not only the access point, but typically the wired network that it's connected to as well. Some cases we have rogue access points. Rogue access point and evil twin are technically the same thing. They basically mimic the legitimate wireless access point in an attempt to get people to connect to that. Once they're connected to my rogue access point, then they're potentially connected to other attacker systems that can steal data from them. And rogue DHCP is very similar as well. This is a DHCP server. Whether it's an access point or a regular DHCP server, it's a server that's giving out IP addresses on a network that it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be there. And so that can just cause lack of connectivity, or it could cause information theft. In this final topic, we're going to look at actually protecting the network. So we've described security concepts and principles. We've talked about different threats and vulnerabilities that exist in the process of risk management. But now it's time to look at the actual controls we can put in place to protect the network. So just as threats and vulnerabilities vary, so do the protective mechanisms that organizations have and can put in place to protect against those. There are a number of different considerations for protecting your network. First off, we need to identify the most critical assets, and we need to prioritize risk. Okay, as we said before, not every risk is worth protecting. Maybe it's just because it's very unlikely to be achieved successfully or exploited, or the asset itself is just not overly critical to day-to-day operations. It doesn't represent enough of a loss. Well, that's all part of risk management and prioritizing risk. In addition to that, though, we have a certain amount of budget that we can spend on network security, right? And so that may play a part as well. We had mentioned that some risk, it's just too expensive to try to protect yourself from that. And so the organization has to decide what's the most critical, how much do we want to spend, what are the options that are available for each asset, and we have to then choose and implement those options as they are appropriate. The establishment of physical barriers is very important. It's as important as logical barriers created by network protection devices. So we need to not forget about physical security. The level of physical protection is going to vary based on the importance of the asset, the overall security posture of the organization, as well as the budget. But we have lots of physical controls that can be put in place to make sure that unauthorized individuals aren't able to get into certain areas within our company. So what are some of those physical security options? Well, we have man traps. That's one. It's sort of a funny name. A man trap is a protected area that has two doors, an entrance door and an exit door. The area in the middle is known as the man trap. The only way you get through door number 2 is when door number 1 is locked. Okay, these usually also correspond with key fobs and or security guards and video surveillance. I've personally only seen one man trap in my life. It was in Philadelphia at the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, very high security environment. So anyway, you had to go through a man trap. You were being x-rayed in the man trap. There were physical security guards there as well. So that's a high-end security option. Locked doors, of course, is pretty standard. Network closets, data centers, server cabinets, wiring closets is a network closet. All of those should be behind locked doors. We should be controlling the level of access to those physical locations in conjunction with potentially video surveillance. Okay, video surveillance can be in the form of IP cameras and closed circuit television, might involve motion detection as well, but gives us a record of physical access to different spots. Door access controls, key fobs, proximity readers, which is just basically needed to scan a key card in order to get into that door. That can track not only that somebody was able to access, but potentially it would even know who accessed for the purposes of auditing. We can use biometrics, retina scanners, iris scanners, fingerprint, voice recognition, any and all of those things. That's, of course, some a higher level of security, at least as it relates to physical controls. A lot of us have these on laptops and whatnot now, but we're talking about to get into areas of the building. Nothing really replaces an actual security guard. So the larger the organization, the more likely that you've got physical guards checking IDs of employees who are trying to enter, monitoring video surveillance systems actively, things like that. Fences, external lighting, asset tracking tags on devices and computers. All of these are options. Will you utilize all of these in your network? Probably not. Especially smaller organizations are unlikely to have physical guards, man traps, key fobs, that kind of thing. But you can have a different variation of these just depending on the situation. Anti-malware comes in different forms. Anti-malware has the primary purpose of keeping systems protected from existing and new malicious code-based attacks. We're all familiar with the term antivirus, or AV. AV software runs on a computer. It can run on a server. It can be managed individually, or it can be managed centrally on the network. AV software also might run in other communication systems like email system. Okay, the idea is to keep viruses out, to detect them when they're coming through, and to prevent them from getting in to the network. Anti-spam has the same functionality, but it's against unsolicited junk email. Okay, certain studies say that about 90% of messages out on the internet are actually junk mail. Well, that's pretty big problem. It causes users to waste time at the very least, but it can also be used with phishing campaigns and used to get actual access to the system. So anti-spam is going to run typically at the network perimeter, at the email servers, and be scanning for junk mail and blocking it or quarantining it. Anti-spyware, similar to antivirus in that except that it's targeting adware and spyware. A lot of your AV vendors out there produce programs that are both antivirus and anti-spyware, as well as having pop-up blockers. Although pop-up blockers, that could be just inherent to the web browser. Modern web browsers have the ability to block unwanted pop-ups as well. Anti-malware is extremely important on any system, and it requires some additional consideration. Cost, what you get what you pay for. There are a lot of antiviruses out there that are free. They don't really hold up to the more expensive antivirus software that you have to pay for, and that kind of stands to reason. They're going to vary in their response time. How quickly do they respond to new threats? That's going to be based on the vendor and requires you to do a little bit of research. Automatic definition updates should be a given, meaning I don't want to have to manually tell my antivirus software to go out and update the virus definitions. It should go out and do that on its own. And there are several different types. There are cloud-based antivirus systems. Host-based, which would be personal. I just install it on my computer. It's just scanning that computer. Any updates happen on that particular system. And then enterprise, network-based. The difference is the automatic definition updates, the scans that can all be mandated through policies in a network-based AV program. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at some anti-malware options. As we've discussed, anti-malware is very important in order to keep your systems protected. In most networks, we'll have some sort of centralized AV as well as anti-spam implemented at the network perimeter, but we do have this included in the Windows operating system. And rather than get specific with one particular vendor, we're just going to look at some of the options that you have in Windows. But believe me, there are many. There's Trend Micro, Komodo, WebRoot, AVG is a free one. Of course, you have the McAfee, of the Nortons. There are multiple possibilities. So from an organizational perspective, it may already be decided for you, or you may be in charge of deciding. And what we're looking for is, quick updates when new viruses hit the internet, automatic definition updates, centralized management, those kinds of things, real-time and scheduled scans. All of those are important. Now in Windows, this is now all under the Windows Defender, not only the Windows Defender firewall, but the Windows security section. Okay, so virus and threat protection, firewall and network protection, as well as other things. So we open up Windows Security, and that's going to give me access to the virus protection that is inherent in Windows. Now it says no current threats, and it tells me the last time that was a scan, but that was, that's 4 days ago. So you can do a quick scan if you want. That's going to scan the most common areas of malware, or you can select scanning options. Let's go ahead and maximize this. So we have full scan or custom scan, and we can decide exactly what we want to do, and we can scan now. Okay, now, again, this is not the greatest, but it's the one that's built into Windows. So it at least provides us with some inherent protection. You can go into to settings and manage notifications. You can also manage other apps and service providers. So, the Windows utility has the ability to do real-time scans and manual scans. We also have the ability in here to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date protection. So we'll go check for updates. It shows the last time that was updated. We can just make sure that we've got the most recent stuff. Now this all plugs into Windows Update, so there's not a ton out there. And then you can also have ransomware protection. And we can protect individual files, folders, and memory areas from unauthorized changes to applications. You can then control the folders that are actually protected. All this in addition to just the regular firewall protection. And firewall protection is built in as well to the Windows operating system. We can configure profiles. Profile is basically dependent on the network that you're connected to. We can allow programs through the firewall, or we can click on advanced settings, and that's going to open up your MMC snap-in for the Windows firewall with advanced security. That is then going to allow us to see the rules that allow traffic into this machine. We can filter that by the profile we're connected. We can filter it by whether it's enabled or not, or you can filter it by different groups like core networking. What's allowed here? What are all the rules? Because the Windows firewall is on, and it will block traffic if not explicitly allowed. We also have outbound rules, and we have connection security rules, which represent the integration with IPsec. As we've mentioned, IPsec can be used inside the organization's network. Okay, so like I said, that's built into Windows, and that's pretty easy to do. We can also just do a quick Google search for enterprise AV programs. Let's just do the full antivirus just in case. And you're going to find that there are multiple options for you. But typically, enterprise antivirus are going to be those that allow for central management, on-demand and scheduled scans, on-demand and scheduled antivirus updates, and just a better management from an enterprise perspective. Okay, so like I said, we wanted to at least look at something. We've got the built-in utilities in Windows that allow us to do that. But from an enterprise standpoint, AV is very important. And this is something that you want to take some time as it relates to deciding which program you want to go with. Network hardening is just a term that describes a security posture that is going to try to eliminate vulnerabilities as a default. We're going to go through and we're going to quote unquote harden the systems. All that means is we're going to go through and do a number of things that we've already talked about, but we're going to have a process and a procedure for doing this. So operating systems would always, we would centrally manage firmware and patches, making sure that we can scan for the lack of patches and that we can push those out or even require them before a system is able to connect. We would try to identify and disable unnecessary services. That would be operating system hardening. Network device hardening could include a number of things. Switch port security. Okay, so we can just turn on security for switch ports. We can set up VLANs and enforce VLAN configuration. We can disable switch ports that aren't needed so that they can't be used to provide a physical connection to the network. On switches, DHCP, and wireless access point, we can use MAC filters. Remember, the MAC address is always going to be in these packets, and so we can allow or disallow based on MAC address. Now, that's not the end-all be-all, because MAC addresses can be easily spoofed. However, it is an extra level of control that could be put in place. And then definitely access control list, packet filters. These define the type of traffic that can go through either a particular port or a particular system. IP filters are based on source and destination IP addresses or network ranges. Port filters are going to be based on the ports which are associated with an application layer protocol. Web content filters would be more of a proxy server thing where we're preventing users from going to particular non-business related websites. Now, that may just be from a efficiency standpoint. We don't want them wasting time. It could also be that those sites are more likely to have dangerous content. Now, another important aspect of network hardening is securing the actual network communication, securing the protocols that are used to communicate from client to server, server to server, the ports and protocols that are used to administer network devices and servers. And so basically, as a general rule of thumb here, we always want to use secure protocols. A protocol that transmits information in plain text is not going to be secure. We need encryption. We need authentication. Potentially mutual authentication of both sides of the connection. So choosing SSH, for instance, to remotely manage switches, routers, firewalls, as opposed to Telnet. Telnet does not require encryption. Secure Shell uses encryption. Using TLS or SSL in conjunction with a number of protocols like SMTP can operate with TLS. IMAP and POP, which are email protocols, can operate with that. FTP has a secure counterpart that uses SSL. Okay, so using some level of security, of course, we mentioned HTTPS directly after that. That is HTTP with SSL. It provides encryption and authentication. IPsec, we mentioned in conjunction with VPNs. It can also be used internally in what's called a transport mode to protect protocols that don't provide an inherent level of protection. IPsec is actually a suite of protocols that provides mutual authentication and data encryption between two endpoints. SNMP version 3 supports stronger encryption and community names that allow us to secure the SNMP protocol, and SFTP is FTP with SSL. Okay, so again, in general, just if you're going to have multiple choices for protocols, whether it's remote access, file access, web, email access, you're always going to have multiple protocols. Some of those protocols are going to be insecure. So as a general rule, we always want to try to use the most secure protocols that we have available to us. Here's some additional best practices for network hardening. Securing SNMP. SNMP is used to monitor network devices, obtain information about those network devices, and even configure those network devices. So it stands to reason that that's a lot of power with that protocol, and we need to secure it as much as possible using encryption and community names. Router advertisement guards. This is something that happens with IPv6. And routers are advertising themselves to one another and their prefixes. A router advertisement guard is basically the ability to control the routers that you will accept these messages from. Okay? We've already mentioned changing default passwords several times because those are freely available on the internet, so we don't want to use that default configuration. The default VLAN kind of goes along with that as well. It is used to the default VLAN is going to be default, and everybody knows exactly what it is. It's either called default or VLAN 1, so it makes it very easy to spoof and get in. If you've changed it to something that's more logical for our organization, then it makes it a little bit more difficult. DHCP snooping is a security feature that acts like a firewall between untrusted host and a trusted DHCP server. So it will essentially validate that the messages were received from an untrusted source. It's going to filter out invalid messages. It'll have rate limits from trusted and untrusted sources, and it can build a special database which contains information about untrusted hosts that have leased IP addresses. An untrusted host would be like a mobile device, something that doesn't belong to the domain. It's not an organizational device. So it's allowing them to get access. It's giving them an IP address, but it's validating the messages and it's holding on to information about them. Firewall rules: implicit deny or explicit deny. Implicit deny, we mentioned before, it's, you're not on the list, so therefore you don't get access. An explicit deny is a rule that explicitly denies something. So a lot of firewalls, and this gets a little confusing. A lot of firewalls, the vast majority, will have implicit deny by default, but the way that they're implementing that kind of practice is by having a default rule. So you have a list of 10 rules, and the last rule says any source, any destination, block. That is actually an explicit deny rule, but it was there by default. So the security posture, the approach, is implicitly denying. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So, I mean, we either, and others might not do that. They might just say, okay, well, no, you actually, if it's not in the list of allowed traffic, then it is automatically denied. That's a true implicit deny. In this demonstration, we're going to look at hardening of systems, some of the things that you can do in order to ensure that the system is secure. Now, we've already talked about a number of things like identifying unnecessary services and open ports. Just show you the netstat utility here that can be used, netstat-a, which shows active listening connections on the system. If you do netstat-a-b, it's actually going to show you the program executable that's listening on a particular port. Now, Resource Monitor in the Network tab also shows you this information, but netstat gives it to you from a command line approach. So that's one thing, identifying unnecessary services and either uninstalling the programs that are associated with that service or just disabling the service. You can certainly go into the Services Management Console and you can just turn off services that aren't needed, but it is better for you to kind of find the program that's utilizing that service and shut it down that way. From the terms of patch management, we're not going to go all the way through things like SCCM or WSUS, but you do have Windows Update on your clients and on your servers. Group policy, if nothing else, group policy in an Active Directory environment can be used to forcibly update these systems, okay, to make sure that they've got the most up-to-date patches. Now you can see here, this one's pending a restart. Group policy can also forcibly restart those systems on a scheduled basis when there are updates that need to be applied. Now it'll kill my demo here if I restart this right now, so I won't do that. But you can go in and check for updates and forcibly restart or schedule the restart. We can also change active hours. This would be the time when we're basically telling Windows this is when we use this device, so we don't want to restart during these times. Probably, well, it's applicable to both clients and servers. And then you've got some advanced options on whether you want updates for just Windows or other Microsoft products. Okay, so SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, those kinds of things. If you want to show update notifications, those kinds of things. Again, all of that can be configured via group policy. And in group policy, if we do use a centralized patch management system like Windows Server Update Services, group policy is used to force clients and servers to look at internal update servers as opposed to just going outside. Wanted to talk a little bit about SSL here. That's one way, of course, we can harden servers is by making sure we're using SSL certificates. Let's just go to Google.com even though I'm probably not putting anything in here that needs to be secure. Notice we have HTTPS up in the browser bar. I just want to show you a little bit about this so that you're aware of it. You can always click on the lockbox depending on your browser. It can appear there or before the URL. And you can see that you're connected to a server that's identified itself as www.google.com. We can hit View Certificates and we can see, who this was issued to, who it was issued by. You can see other details in here, like, for instance, the subject name. Okay, and sometimes there are multiple names, so that's called the subject alternative name. Multiple names that can be in the certificate. Actually, we've got that as well, even though it's just got one name. And then the certification path, because SSL certificates are issued by what are called certificate authorities. And the certificate authority is sort of that trusted entity, assuming you and I both trust it, that issued out and verifies the identity of this system. It's in some cases you may try to go to a URL and you get a certificate warning that pops up. That's not always bad. If you know the system you're connecting to, it probably just means the certificate was self-signed. A self-signed certificate is basically a system saying this is who I am and the authority is me. You know, I am who I said I am because I said I was. Well, that doesn't really work with Google and eBay and Amazon and other places. You want to make sure that the names match and that it came from a trusted authority. But if I'm connecting, say, to a firewall web interface, or I'm connecting to an ESXi server for VMware, then you're going to get certificate warnings. And it's, as I said, it's not always a bad thing. You just have to be careful as to where you are going. IPsec is another way to secure systems. I just wanted to go through that real quick. We've mentioned it a couple of times. All right, we're going to back up and we're going to go into the advanced settings. Now, we won't go through this completely, but connection security rules allow us to create IPsec policies in the Windows operating system. IPsec is predominantly used in VPNs, but it can be used in what's called transport mode. We can create a rule and we can specify that I want to encrypt and authenticate very specific traffic. Okay, so I would say, you know, any IP address to this IP address, and I'll add in my own IP address here. Okay, and then we can hit next. I'm going to say I want to request or require authentication, or I can require authentication for both inbound and outbound. So I'm going to say we're going to require mutual authentication. You can do this, you can authenticate via computer certificate, which is the most secure, but you can also add in other options like Kerberos or a pre-shared key. The pre-shared key is not recommended simply because it's not even available for the second one, but it was available over here. It's not recommended just because it's listed here in plain text. All right, so it's a little bit, it's not quite as secure, but ironically, when you do site-to-site VPN connections, you typically are using the pre-shared key method. Pick the profile that this applies to the firewall. This is just a test rule. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit finish. There we see the... Okay, I accidentally hit finish. I wasn't intending to hit finish because as soon as I did that, that killed my connection. Why? Because I just said we were going to utilize IPsec connections for all, or IPsec protection for all connections. So what it did was it killed my remote desktop connection to that server, which is okay because it illustrates the point. What we really want to do is we want to go in and we want to actually configure that IPsec policy for particular ports. So be careful with IPsec. It is very secure, but it also can eliminate connections very easily, as we just saw that it did. Certificates, if you are getting certificates, the easiest way is to get certificates from a public certificate authority. If you have a web server, email server, something like that, you definitely want to be using certificates, and you need to get them from a trusted entity. Otherwise, clients will get that certificate warning when they try to connect to you. Okay, so those are just some network hardening options that we've got, making sure we've got patch management, we've eliminated unnecessary services, possibly utilizing IPsec for particular types of traffic. And as we saw, we just want to be careful in doing that. So that's going to complete this demonstration where we looked at system hardening. With wireless, we have different security mechanisms that we can utilize. MAC filtering we've mentioned already, making sure that your MAC address is one of the authorized MAC addresses before giving you access to a wireless access point. I believe when we were talking in an earlier chapter, we mentioned about antenna placement, but we also have power levels. So you can adjust the location of antennas so that the wireless signal does not exceed what is required, such as going out into a parking lot or across the street. You can also adjust the power levels on that antenna to achieve the same thing. In many cases, wireless clients are isolated from the rest of the network. And so you can gain access to the wireless network, and you may be controlled in what you can get access to. Okay. That's not always the case, but that's what wireless client isolation would be. You're on a different subnet or a different VLAN. Now we can control whether you have the ability to access all network resources or just certain network resources. And at the very least, if we're doing wireless for guest, we should have guest network isolation so that they are unable to access corporate resources when they're connected to the wireless network. In that sense, the wireless network is really just there to provide them with connectivity to the internet. Using secure pre-shared keys in Wi-Fi protected access, WPA and WPA2, the pre-shared key is not the encryption, the passphrase, or it's not the encryption key itself, but it protects the encryption key. And so if you have real simple, easy to guess passwords or passphrases, then that's kind of the same thing as having a really bland, insecure password for a user account. So we want to make sure that those are secure and that those are protected. Geofencing is a term that can be used for other things other than wireless. This is actually something that we implement all the time in the Azure cloud, where we put in rules that say that users can't access any resources in that tenant if they're outside the US. Okay, and then we add other countries if necessary for that particular company. That's a type of geofencing. You're only allowing access from a particular geographic area. And again, it can be done in terms of wireless security as well. Captive portals, I'm sure we've all seen these. This is where you actually have to go to a web page to get access to the wireless network. So you connect, and the wireless network is non-secure in that it just allows you to connect, but then your browser opens up and you're at a hotel, so you have to type in your last name and a room number, or you have to type in the code for the day that the front desk gave you. Things like that. Those are referred to as captive portals. Authentication is the mechanism for securing the network against unauthorized use. We got a couple different types of authentication, internal and then those that are associated with remote access. But the purpose is the same. We need to validate who you are before we can determine whether you're able to log in and whether you're able to access resources. Internal in Windows Active Directory environments, we use a protocol called Kerberos. The Kerberos service is running on domain controllers, and authentication attempts go to the Kerberos or KDC, and you're authenticated and then you're allowed in. Often internally, we'll have something called single sign-on, which means I log into the computer one time and I'm not asked to log in every time I try to access a network resource. Single sign-on can just be for file and data access, access to other computers, but it can also extend to applications as well, depending on how we've set it up. And then there are various types of remote access authentication. I believe we talked about all of these in the VPN section, but I just have them mentioned here because they were in the security objectives too. PAP should never be used because it's plain text. CHAP is a very old protocol as well. And in Microsoft, you should always be using MS Chat version 2, or ideally EAP. EAP has several different forms, and it's going to be the most secure remote access protocol. Stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol. Radius is used to forward authentication requests to a central server. This can be used for VPN access, for wireless access points, just getting connected to a switch port. You could have Radius for all of those. And TACACS Plus is it's very similar to Radius. It's just a Cisco proprietary protocol, whereas Radius is a vendor neutral standard. In terms of authentication, single-factor authentication just asks one question of you. Okay, what is your username and what is your password? Okay, I suppose that's two questions, but it's it's the combination of those two. It's just something you know, username and password. Multi-factor authentication is more secure. Multi-factor can ask the user to provide two or more methods of verification. These factors fit into these different categories. Something you know, username, password. Something you have, an app on a phone, like that, is this you, and you're approving it, a smart card, a fob, a hardware token of some sort that validates who you are. You have to type in a special code. Something you are would be biometrics. Okay, so it's scanning fingerprints, facial recognition, iris and retina scanners, etc. And then somewhere you are. Sometimes this goes with the geofencing. You have to be in a particular location, like on premises, in order to gain access to something. And then just something you do, the activity that you're attempting. So it's the first three that are the most common. Username and password is the most common for single factor. Multi-factor, we typically then ask for something that you have, whether it's a hardware token or now more modern, it would be apps on smartphones that you have to approve your access. Multi-factor authentication is going to greatly increase security, whether you require it all the time or just sometimes based on where they're coming from, like outside the network, is up to you. But I think, as I mentioned before, cybersecurity insurance providers are requiring MFA. We do MFA projects all day long for my company, and it's because most of these people are being forced into doing it because it is just far more secure than having single-factor authentication. Network access control is a general term to describe a set of technologies, protocols, and standards that are used to enforce system security at the time of connection. The goal would be to allow people to connect their device, whether via remote access, wireless, or wired, but to prevent infected systems from connecting to the network, to enforce corporate policies, to be able to identify who's accessing and how they're accessing. Multiple standards exist here. 802.1x uses radius to forward authentication attempts from a switch or a wireless access point to a central device. There are different authentication protocols that are used. IPsec is one form of this, but the most basic form is you connect, your connection request goes to a central device, and then we're going to validate certain things about the connection, like you have a firewall, like you have antivirus and it's up to date, like you've got the most recent patches for your operating system. And only then are you allowed to connect. Okay, now you could truly be isolated, isolated subnet where you could hit a server to get updates to antivirus and things like that. Or you could be isolated via IPsec, and that's why that's mentioned here. Because IPsec is a very secure protocol, and basically computer A and computer B, if they're going to communicate with one another, they both have to have IPsec turned on and set up. And so if you have a secure area of the network that requires IPsec, and this other area of the network that does not, then you've already provided isolation without having to do physical isolation. So network access control, otherwise known as network access quarantine, is all about making sure that you adhere to certain requirements before you're able to connect to the system. In this chapter, we looked at network security. We started with network security fundamentals, some of the general security concepts and principles that you need to be familiar with, and the importance they play in overall organizational security. We talked about planning for network security by identifying threats, vulnerabilities, and assessing risks to critical assets with the sole purpose of us then being able to protect the network. In that final topic, we looked at different controls that can be put in place at the operating system level, at the network level, at the application level in order to protect organizational assets.